Here we are with Tea with Marie in the tenement house in Woonsocket, which is not a real tenement house, but a replication of the three-story tenement houses that they had. And we're at the Museum of Work and Culture in Woonsocket, and I'm here with Raymond Bacon, which
Thank
is
you, Marie.
and he is the co-director or co-site, co-site manager. Right? And we're going to take a little trip through this wonderful museum today and try to show everybody all around the state what it's like. And it really is an important museum. Right now we have school children going through it downstairs, but afterwards we're going to go take a tour through it. But first I want to talk a little bit to Raymond. And I forgot to mention that I'm Marie Younkin-Waldman, by the way, here with Tea with Marie. And Raymond, we're inside this three-family tenement which replicates something that could have been built between 1895 or 1925.
Yeah, this is a good representation of what was so ubiquitous back in those days. I think these were built by the thousands. And what we try to do here at the museum is to, well, actually to teach and show our visitors what life was like in Woonsocket and many other communities in New England, especially mill towns.
Yeah, and what kind of things do we have in the room that would depict that?
This room, which is the parlor, by the way, is a 1929 representation of a parlor. We have something which just came around the corner not too many years ago. The radio, very important part, became a focal point. I guess by today's standards you'd call it the entertainment center. All this is possible because of electricity. By this time electricity was now common. We have a radiator, so we have some kind of heating system which became, again...
They start in that era?
Right, it was very common in that era, the radiator.
That was forced hot air or something?
Well, it's steam.
Oh,
it's steam, yeah.
Okay.
And of course we have the telephone to my left, which became a commonplace. We have a piano, a player piano. We have
another part of the entertainment system.
Right. And now that people had a little more leisure time than they had in the previous 100 years, let's say, they were able to come home at night. This parlor really represents a person who could afford some of the things that were now available.
Now the whole concept of the parlor must have been different too.
Well, it's a place where people would have, where they would receive visitors. You would enter the house, and if it was a more formal setting, you would come to the parlor. And next to the parlor was something that we try to represent here as a dining room. Beyond those doors, those French doors.
Didn't mill workers initially just have kitchens?
Oh, sure. But
so the concept of having a parlor meant they were moving up a step,
well,
didn't it? And
this is true. In this particular case, we like to think of this tenement house, this triple-decker, as being owned by an overseer, someone who would be a little more able to finance the building of such a structure. Upstairs you would have maybe 4 families that would live.
And they may be connected, right?
Yes, exactly, and they may or may not have had parlors.
And so this gave people at that time an opportunity to own a home.
Absolutely, absolutely. With the overseer living on the first floor, he was able to get additional income from his tenants. And wages were not the very best in the world, but things were happening in the 1920s that had never happened before. The standard of living was raised immensely from what it had been even 50 years.
So this was the beginning of the middle class?
The beginning, or the strength of the middle class. After the turn of the century, as you know, after World War I, there was what I would call a second industrial revolution, where now you had mass consumption, mass production, and beyond that, they had to resort to advertising on a mass scale to, in a way, force people to buy goods. You know, those ads that would appear in the magazines, in the newspapers, and even now on radio, would tell people you can't live without this product. And it certainly is a characteristic of the 1920s. And we stop in 1929 because little did they know at the time that the Depression was right around the corner.
And that's when the stock market
That's when the market fell, and of course we were caught with things like overproduction and
I wonder what would have happened if the market had not fallen then, or if something had been done so that that wouldn't have happened. It would
Well,
have been a different lifestyle.
I think it taught us a lesson as to how to control the market. Things like the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, has now been able to control some of this wildness that took place.
Because of what we learned back then.
Right, marginal buying and so on.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this building and how the museum came to be, and then after we talk here, we're going to go downstairs and take a look around the museum and find out more about the history that actually took place here in the Woonsocket area with the Industrial Revolution.
Well, the idea of a museum, the concept, is something that goes back to Woonsocket's centennial in 1988 when we celebrated the incorporation of Woonsocket as a city. It was a year-long celebration, and one of the ideas that came across at the end was something brought forth by our mayor, Charles Baldelli, who felt there should be a place where we could tell a story, a permanent location. And since the National Corridor had been created in 1986 by the federal government, each community along the Blackstone River was asked to contribute somehow to the story of the Blackstone Valley. Places like Pawtucket, for example, already had their story with the Slater Mill,
And we've done a
the
show
technology
there
and so on. So what Woonsocket chose to do after a series of discussions with panels that were assembled by local individuals along with scholars and so on, was to tell the story of the working people, the people who came to work in these mills, whether they be Native Americans in the sense of people born here, or whether they be immigrants, especially the story of the immigrants. And in Woonsocket, this story translated into the French Canadians, because by the 1930s, statistics show that 70% of the population of Woonsocket was French Canadian. So you did have an overwhelming
So
number.
they had a reputation for being a town in the whole country that was like France or something, isn't it?
Well, they called it in some areas la ville la plus française des États-Unis, or the most French city in the United States. But this was true. This was true. But it's a story of immigration. Not only does it apply to French Canadians, but it applies to even immigrants today who come to this country. How to assimilate, how to incorporate the values of the old country with that of their new
That's
nation.
a very important point when we have so many different immigrants coming from so many different places today.
And it's more than language. We talk about, as you mentioned, the word in French Canadian words, it's the survivance, which means more than just surviving, more than retaining your language, but also retaining the culture. The culture is one of those things that has so many facets that even food is one of those facets. So that this is the problem that they had to resolve. And this is the story we tell from their arrival, leaving their farms in Quebec, until finally by the 1930s, with their acceptance of things like organized labor during the period.
So they're going from an agricultural way of life to an industrial way of life, and that's a big change too.
Yeah, and how do you carry this over in your everyday life? And part of that had to do with organizing labor itself. I don't know if you know.
And I understand that there's a lot in this museum that talks about the whole way that organized labor, and they were the first in the country, or among
Well, they were one of the first. They preceded the CIO in organizing the ITU, which was a union based on a whole industry as opposed to a skilled group, as for example the American Federation of Labor, which organized around skilled labor, whereas the CIO later on, after the formation of the ITU, those two organized everybody from, let's say, the sweeper in the mill to the skilled craftsman like the mule spinner, so that they became an industrial union.
Why do you suppose the labor unions got organized there? What factors were the French Canadian in particularly bringing to that?
Well, at first there was a great reluctance, because their teachings told them that they should be more subservient, more docile. Even their religious leaders, the cures of their parishes, would tell them, your reward is not of this earth, but just so that you can now...
And the parishes were very powerful too.
Powerful. They were the social center,
right.
Not only religious, but social center of their lives. Until about the Depression period, the 1930s, we began to see a breakdown of this thinking. The advent of the New Deal, which said from now on, collective bargaining or forming unions is legal. So it became, again, an American thing to do.
And they heard about it from someplace, somewhere else?
Many of those people who organized in the previous years, like the Knights of Labor in the 80s and the American Federation of Labor, in Woonsocket, the people who really led the movement were people from Europe, from Belgium and France. They were more the socialists. And these are the people that began to talk about unions for all the workers. These people had experience. So you see some of your early labor
And they came
leaders.
over here and started teaching them and infiltrating?
Yes, because even some of the industrialists in Woonsocket had come from France and Belgium. Not only did they bring their managers with them, but they also brought some of their workers. So this transferred over to the American worker, to the French Canadian in particular, and what was common there was the language. The language was French, so it was easy for them to assimilate.
And we had done another show where we were at the St. Anne's Cultural Center.
Right.
We heard a little bit about the parishes and how involved they were and how they provided to the community social outlets and ways which they might not have had, and gyms and different things like that for them to use. And that was very important too in the Woonsocket area.
Absolutely. Each parish had its own, well, St. Anne's happened to have its own gymnasium, and it had its
Amazing.
own, yeah, whether they...
And so the people were fortunate, but they came here from Quebec and they didn't have that much. And they started out and they were able to start earning money so they could own homes, they could have entertainment, a social life, and probably their lifestyle was better, right?
What they brought with them really was their village, and it became a city that had an overwhelming population of people from Quebec, so a lot of people call this the Canada of the United States.
And we can see this
even in sports,
happening now, today, in many cities and places in Providence and Woonsocket also with new immigrants
Absolutely.
and new cultures coming and the same questions happening. So now we're going to go downstairs and we're going to look around. Thank you, Ray. That was very interesting. To the some of the different exhibits that you have here in the museum.
Which
and
will
talk a
help.
little bit about them. This is called the Slater Room, and appropriately named since a portrait here of Samuel Slater says that he was the leader of the father of American manufacturing, and so obviously they emulated him when they named the name of this room, which represented the organizations for the business people.
Yeah, this is the Museum Slater Club, which is a place where the manufacturers would gather and would talk about the issues of the day. Of course, the image of Samuel Slater, you're right, is kind of like the patron saint of the manufacturers, since he was the father.
And then they have a few others here too. We want to rattle off some of their names here.
One of them is Aaron Potier. In back of you there, Marie, is Aaron Potier. He represents the person who, as mayor of Woonsocket and as governor of Rhode Island, was able to attract industrialists from France and from Belgium to the United States.
And when was that, and what period?
Well, he went there to the Paris Exposition in 1889, and he returned at around 1900 and was able to talk to people like the Chibergiers from France and the Guérins from Belgium to come to the United States and establish their businesses here. So for that reason, he should be remembered. And by the way, as a result, he also is the longest term governor we've ever had in Rhode Island.
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
And
well, now, let's take a look at some of the issues that these are from press releases about some of the issues that they talked about, right?
One of the major issues
Let's
of
walk
the
over
day
here.
is the forming of unions. We talked about that earlier, and this first panel talks about that and how the union organizers tried to reach an understanding with the mill owners as to the, first of all, the legitimacy of the union and the need for it. And of course, they did find resistance. Another issue which is very important at that time is child labor. As you probably know, many of the children who worked in the mills, Samuel Slater was well, actually, his first employees were women and children. And this carried on through the next century until the 1920s and 30s with the arrival of the New Deal, where child labor was basically abolished. And of course, it gave way to public education, because that's one of the demands of the union, that public education be afforded, compulsory education for children.
Yeah, absolutely. And now there was another thing here in November 9th, 1929, where they saw the the South as being competition for them.
The famous Southern Exodus, as you know, that at one time, especially after the American Civil War, the New South was created. And the New South meant that it now had more industries than prior, and as a result, they attracted many more mills that literally closed shop sometimes and went south for cheaper labor and proximity to the crop.
And they were aware of this and they wanted to do something about it, so they kind of saw ahead what's happening today or what's been happening in the past 10 years.
And exactly, and the South today is suffering from the same thing we suffered from, an exodus to, what do they call it today, the...
Southern Exodus?
Well, no, the change of manufacturing from the United States to foreign countries. Using, again, what we call child labor or even cheap labor.
No, but that's the way to get it cheap, but it's not the best way. Okay, well, that gives a couple of issues, so now we're going to move on to another exhibit. This is a very interesting room.
I think what we should do next is maybe go to the classroom and see how children now were becoming more and more educated during this period.
Okay, that's a great idea, since we moved from child labor to putting the children into the classroom.
Absolutely.
All right. Here we're in a classroom, a replication of a classroom that would be anywhere from, what would you say, in the 20s maybe?
Well, actually, this classroom setting is again 1929, but the classroom itself is from the old Vaux Street School, which was built in 1899. So it's kind of typical of a classroom, and in this case, it happens to be a parochial school. And until the 1950s, from the arrival the great arrival of the French Canadians in the 1880s, 90s, into the 20th century, until the mid-1950s, the majority of children went to Catholic schools. And in this particular case, it's a bilingual school, where most French Canadian kids who went to Catholic schools went to French Canadian French and English schools.
And we have over here pictures of the nuns. I guess some of the nuns were...
on the wall we have a picture. We have pictures of the various orders of nuns, and one of them the brothers, who taught in the Woonsocket area. This nun, for example, is a representation of one of the orders, the order that was the most numerous, and they had the most schools, the orders of the Presentation of Mary, and they were originally out of Canada, and eventually through New Hampshire and in Rhode Island.
Then we move over here and we find a brother.
Well, actually, it's a priest.
Oh, priest, I'm sorry.
In this case, it happens to be a priest who came to visit the classroom. And one of the reasons he came to visit is periodically the priest would visit either to give out report cards or to give announcements. And in this case, the story behind his appearance is the story we see on the board. Two issues that took place around this time. One of them had to do with strikes and the morality of strikes, and the nuns, of course, had to teach about whether or not these people were justified in going on strike and so on. And the other one had to do with the Sentinelist affair.
Well, tell us a little bit about the Sentinel affair, because that's interesting.
It's called that because of the newspaper that was published called La Sentinelle. It was a group of French Canadians who felt that the new policies of the government of Rhode Island and the Bishop of Providence threatened their way of life. They felt that English was going to be imposed on them as the sole language. So they resisted this and began to publish a newspaper. Not only publish a newspaper, but began to defend what they thought was their right to teach and to learn in both French and English. And as a result, it ended up in a very serious affair. By 1928, the Bishop of Providence, Bishop Hickey, was sued. And of course, the case fell through, but the Sentinelist movement made a point. Today, people who remember the Sentinelist affair think of it as a time when there was a fight to maintain their culture.
And so now you see schools where, let's take Spanish, for instance, where they're teaching English and Spanish, right?
Well, in the case of the French Canadians, and in my day, in the 1940s, we went to school half a day in French and half a day in English. And the teacher was very often the same nun. So she would teach us American history, English grammar, writing. In the morning, in the afternoon, we'd have our catechism, our history of Canada, our French, everything taught in French. So it was truly bilingual.
Yeah, definitely.
And this carried on even in the high schools. Places like Mount St. Charles in Woonsocket and St. Clair High School were also Catholic bilingual high schools.
Okay, well, this is the classroom. So now we're going to move on and find out about another aspect of life. What's the next one we should see?
The next one I think we should take a look at would be the what we call the Union Hall, and where the Union concerns were vented.
Okay, on to the Union Hall. I can see all these different posters are up now. Well, what did they use this for?
This is a replica of the ITU Hall. The ITU is the Industrial Trades Union, which was formed in 1931 and had about 18,000 members at one time. This is the union in Woonsocket that included skilled and unskilled workers. And the Union Hall was where they assembled, where they had not only meetings, but they also had social gatherings. It became really at one time the social center of the working people. And this was originally located on Federal Street in Woonsocket. And what you see in this hall is a replication of that hall.
So how often did they meet? Every week?
Oh, I don't know what the meetings were, but I'm sure there was at least
there
was somebody here every day, I'm sure, and they would meet here for any kind of important meetings. And what we do here is we have actually a film which shows the evolution of the union.
Which was very important because the unions developed in Woonsocket, and that was one of the places where they really got going, wasn't that true?
Absolutely. It had strong political ties. It took care of the working people themselves. And the union, the ITU, lasted until the 1970s, when eventually it disappeared.
Because the factories disappeared too,
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
And coincidentally, the last local of this union is right next door. The Riverview Furniture Building right next door is where the last local was. But at one time, think of it, 18,000 strong in this industrial union.
That was quite a contribution to the whole concept of union. This exhibit depicts the working conditions of the people in the mills and so forth.
Yeah, this is the mill floor, and over here we try to emphasize not so much the machinery as opposed to the people themselves. For example, this man is a mule spinner, and what he did all day is to literally spin yarn, make yarn. The woman in back of us is working at a loom where they would weave the cloth. And in the background you see a young boy sweeping. So this tells the story of who used to work in these mills. And in the conditions that were not well controlled in the early years. That's why when we talk about the union, we talk about their first aim was to get better working conditions, which included better wages, shorter working hours. The work hours were sometimes 60 hours a week, working 6 days a week and a half day, let's say, on a Saturday. So it made for a very long week, and there was very little time for leisure. However, in the mills themselves, in the mill villages, they did have time for things like baseball, for example.
Baseball, we're going to go over there and see that in a few minutes but when you're talking about the children, and Samuel Slater, I guess, started children back in the 1790 and so forth. Did they not have enough adults, or why did they start putting children to work?
Well, I think the children at the time were available. They were from the farms, so they became an extra hand, as it were, to get extra money.
Yeah, which they had labored on the farms, obviously.
Right, exactly.
Also. Yeah.
But labor on a farm for, let's say a 10-hour day is much different than working in a mill. You at least had the open air, and you could take breaks every so often. In the mill, it wasn't that way at all.
So when they labor on the farm, they weren't really going to school either, so you had to do something with the children, obviously.
You hear stories about even people who are alive today who tell you about very little schooling that they did have. And of course,
and sometimes they would just go to school for a little while and then take them out before they got to high school so they'd work in the mills.
Right, and some of the parents were very obliging to the mill owners, and the age was not always official, so they would tend to
so there had to be, and I guess there were differences in male and female wages also that had to be taken care of.
Absolutely, yeah. Males were certainly preferred. And yet there were some women in the early years who already knew how to weave. And in some cases, I know we don't hear about this too often, they were being paid more because of their skills.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, now we're going to see a little bit about some of the things that people started to do when they had leisure time as their conditions became better.
Very often sponsored by the company itself.
Great. Let's talk about fun.
Well, there was fun in many ways. Of course, a lot of people entertained themselves at home, but even the companies themselves took a very active part in leisure time. As a matter of fact, baseball was a very, very popular sport that these mill owners supported.
And when was that now?
Well, by the 1880s into the 20th century, many of these mill owners supported their own baseball teams and would hire sometimes great baseball players so that they could work in the mill and, of course, be given time to go practice and play games.
This was before the Red Sox.
Oh, yeah, it was before the Red Sox, of course. Red Sox.
Of course, we're thinking about baseball now with the Red Sox.
The American League, of course, was founded in 1901, and coincidentally, the very first winner for the batting average and also home runs was our own Napoleon Lajoie. He won the batting crown with 422 in 1901 and home runs with 13 home runs. In those days, the dead ball, as it were. So he's really the first super.
And I guess the mills wanted to entertain the workers so that they could keep them happy, and they had picnics and they had all kinds of things for them, right?
Absolutely. This was part of the way by which the mill owners were able to, in a way, I hate to say this, control or win the loyalty of the workers. Another mill company which was very strong in that is the U.S. Rubber Company, the one in Woonsocket, the one in Millville. For example, Gabby Hartnett, another baseball Hall of Famer, born in Woonsocket, lived most of his life in Millville, played for the Chicago Cubs, and again is a member of the Hall of Fame along with Lajoie.
And so these were incentives, and these were what kept people here, I guess, when they had something and they get all worked up about baseball and things like that.
I think in the Blackstone Valley, these baseball leagues lasted until the 1960s. Wow. Places like Uxbridge and Pawtucket, the Pawtucket Indians, I believe, which preceded the Pawtucket Red Sox, were part of those industrial
So baseball
leagues.
goes back way far in this area. Okay, then we can understand how they're so crazy about the Red Sox too now.
I think the Woonsocket Baseball Association dates to 1868.
Oh my
so
goodness.
We're getting a lot of years of baseball in Woonsocket.
Okay, now we're going to move on to maybe one more or so. And
I think we can go. We can go back to Canada and visit where these people came from.
That's a great idea. We'll go see the farmhouses. Okay. Inside this little one-room farmhouse, and it doesn't look anything like the parlor room we started out with, Ray.
No, I think it's done so that we can show a contrast between what life was like, let's say, on a farm, maybe in the 1890s, as opposed to what life was like in a city like Woonsocket by the 1920s.
So in one generation, they really improved their lifestyle.
And the first thing you notice about this is how basic it is and how very little they had to work with. No electricity, candlelight or kerosene lanterns. These were the ways by which people, but there was a home. It was really a place where people lived. This one room is only part of the story because very often there were bedrooms either in the back or upstairs in a loft. So some of these families had many children, so they found a place to live. And they lived very basically. The kitchen stove was probably the center of the home.
So that would be the center as opposed to the parlor, which they later on were able to have. And they had the religious influence, which would be something on the
Absolutely.
wall.
The religious icons, the things, the crucifixes they had on the wall, these are all representative of their faith. And one thing about the French Canadians is that they equated their faith with their language. There was an expression that they used called, I'll tell you what it is. It says, celui qui perd sa langue perd sa foi. He who loses his language loses his faith. And this was true in their hearts. When they left Canada to come to the United States, this is one of the things they feared the most.
We've had this wonderful tour with Ray Bacon of the Museum of Work and Culture here in Woonsocket, and I'm standing in front of the poster which says La Survivance, which was the name for cultural survival. And I think when we look at that, we can look today at a lot of other cultures who are fighting for cultural survival and assimilation at the same time into this wonderful country of ours. So that's an important concept, and it goes along with the concepts that Tea with Marie focus on, beauty, gentility, and tranquility. Certainly the beauty and the gentility that come from the culture, from the old world, are very important as they're assimilated into our country. So this has been a great experience for us to experience here at the museum, and we hope that you'll come and visit it sometime when you have a chance. So I'm Marie Younkin-Waldman saying goodbye for now, and don't forget, keep beauty in your lives every single day.